It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
What's up? What's happening? Welcome in. It's the Take Command podcast. I am Craig Hoffman. He is Logan Paulsen, and it's a Mailbag Monday on a Tuesday afternoon, Logan, because sometimes that be how the schedule goes in the summer.
That's how schedules be scheduling, man.
Yeah, we're very excited for the Thursday pod, the late week pod this week. We have a fun charity Commanders quiz challenge. I honestly don't even know. I scheduled it. We have a guest like Bob Barker situation who's going to come in and quiz us. So Logan and I are going to look dumb on the late week pod when we are terrible at Commanders trivia. But we figured
I'm
we'd
so
look
worried
smart.
about that.
We're going to try to look smart with questions that we picked for the mailbag, Logan. They were just trying to get life is the yin and yang, the zen of balance.
No, 100%. Yeah, I was like, you told me we were doing that, and I was like, that's going to be terrible, man. Like, I know a lot about Commanders and Washington football team history and all that kind of stuff, but some of the trivia stuff's pretty outside my area of expertise. So this one's going to be a nice, easy fastball right down the middle. The other one's going to be a little bit more challenging. Yeah.
I know the premise is like a chuckle for charity, and I was like, boy, are you asking us to be set up for success on the chuckle part?
Yeah.
So that'll be fun later in the week, and then we're working on some other stuff as well. Of course, training camp's less than 10 days away.
Crazy.
At this point. It's absolutely bonkers, so we'll have practice and such to talk about before long. But look, we spent so much time on ranking everything in sight the last couple of weeks, because that is kind of what happens this time of year as we preview things from a bunch of different aspects. And you actually got a question that I thought was interesting to start off our mailbag for today, which is basically, what's the criteria? And as someone who does a sports talk radio show daily and looks at a million lists and is always curious in that, I do think it's probably good for us to talk about how we've done some of our rankings. And specifically, I think the one that it was in response to that's probably our most popular rankings that we've done now for a couple years in a row is our position group rankings, right? So when we look at, hey, who's the best quarterback or the best running back group or the best whatever in the NFL or in the NFC East in our case, what are you basing that off of who's the best, who's the worst, and how we line those up relative to each other in between?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough because I think there's a couple things that go into the bucket. One is I kind of try to approach it as if I was a GM, right? And if I was kind of making a team, who are the pieces that I'd want to be involved in, right? So when you're the GM, there's a couple different criteria that go into it. It's age, it's potential. They're thinking more kind of longitudinally as opposed to when I put my coaching hat on, it's like, who's the best player right now, right? And then there's also my personal talent evaluation where it's like, I watched this guy 10 times last year. And I went back and rewatched his film a couple times, and there's something about him that I like that maybe the other national media correspondents don't like. And so for me, it's weighing all of those factors. I think a good example of that was when we were doing tight end rooms, and it was like, oh, you were like Dallas Goedert is the number one guy in the division. I kind of was like, I actually like Tony Ferguson a little bit better, or Ferguson, the guy in Dallas, a little bit more. I just think he's got a more complete game. Now, if we're looking from a coaching perspective, in a talent evaluation, that's what I would, those kind of coincide. But if I put my GM hat on, it's like Dallas Goedert's probably the guy because he has the height, weight, speed, kind of the explosiveness that would kind of push him into that number one group. So I think it's all those things coming together. And I think, in the question, it kind of asks what is the degree of separation? And very rarely in the NFL, is there a drastic degree of separation? Obviously, there are certain examples, like if you're taking George Kittle versus, the tight end in Miami currently, right? It's maybe the best guy in the NFL versus someone who's kind of a average to below average player at the position, right? And there's a huge discrepancy there, and that's represented usually in the financial elements of the contract. But I think, I think a good example of that is maybe B-Rob and Saquon Barkley or the Philadelphia running back rooms. I remember talking through that pretty extensively and being like, in actuality, the difference in terms of effect on the team is marginal, right? However, when you take Saquon out of New York and you put him behind arguably the best offensive line in football with a quarterback who can run the ball, and they've done such a good job of getting their running backs in space over the last 4 years, like that becomes a crazy value add. So again, like the value is not just the player, it's also the scheme. So that's really like a long roundabout way to say that it's multifactorial, it's very subjective, and it's situation dependent, really.
Yeah, mine's just vibes.
Vibes.
Straight vibes. No, I'm just kidding.
Vibes.
Yeah, vibes and how good's your beard? No, for me it's a combination. Like one, I would say for the rankings that we've done, it's about this year. So things like age only matter to the extent that I'm looking at your experience as a positive or your potential decline as a negative, but I'm not trying to project that 2-3 years down the road. I'm not taking in contract even. Like I'm not going to rank someone above another because at dollar for dollar they're a better value. Like I'm just looking at, okay, we're lining up in the playground. I'm trying to win as many games as I can in 2024. Who am I picking? Like that's actually the easiest way to describe it. Now that is going to be influenced by some of the schematic stuff that you're talking about, right? Like Saquon is enhanced in Philly in a way that was pretty rough for him in New York, where he was kind of asked to be the hero, where Philly, it's like, we're going to set you up to be successful because we have the right personnel around you, and we think schematically Kellen Moore will try to get Saquon the ball in space, and like that's been a hallmark of Sirianni throughout multiple OCs now, and was a hallmark of his back when he was doing that himself. So I think that's like the basic answer, right, is like, who would you want to have on your team? Right. And I think another... And that doesn't necessarily always translate in ways that are as visible, I think, to fans, which goes to, I think, what is actually the best example of this that we've done recently, which is there's a huge disconnect on the Jalen Hurts versus Dak Prescott discussion when it comes to best quarterback in the NFC East. And for me, the easy way to describe it is Dak does more things well than Jalen does. So Hurts does a couple of things really, really well, but it's a very finite small, like 2 or 3. Like he runs the ball really well. He throws the ball to the outside pretty well. And, there's a couple other things that he does at a high level. But, like, those are his 2 superpowers. Dak has the entire playbook in his pocket at the line of scrimmage, is effective at communicating it, so you're in more good plays more often before the snap. He's very, very good at diagnosing post-snap. He has every throw available to him in the book, deep, short, middle of the field, outside, everything. He's got good touch and good accuracy and all that stuff. And so that wide variety of potential good outcomes and the consistency with which he gets them is a separator, even though a couple years ago Jalen Hurts was, MVP level, without a doubt. But snap in, snap out, I'd rather have Dak Prescott. And so I think those are some of the things that we look at is, how consistent is a player, how much can they do, right? Versatility matters. Not just like, oh, he can kind of do a bunch of stuff all right, but like guys like Saquon or guys like Dak in their own ways at their positions, they do a bunch of different things that you want that position to be able to do really, really well. And then you factor in kind of the pieces around them. Dak gets certainly a boost from CD and the other way around. Saquon gets a boost from the Eagles' offensive line, and that kind of ultimately paints a full picture of what I think that it is that goes into the rankings that we've done, especially the last couple of weeks this offseason. Yeah,
and I think, like, when you watch a lot of film, and we watch a lot of football like we do, I think certain things pop to light that maybe, and I think that's what we're trying to illuminate there are those little variables. Like, I think Dak Prescott's a great example of this. Like, I know he has the reputation nationally of being a little bit, he chokes in the big moment or there's a lack of consistency, but when you watch down-to-down throws, like, that's the guy you want helming your offense. And there's really not a lot of questions about it, in my opinion. Obviously, like, if you're going to run an offense that's built for Jalen Hurts, where we're going to run kind of the NFL triple option, where we're reading defensive ends, we're getting out of the pocket, we've got, the passing option on the screen outside, like, then I might change my opinion because the schematically it's a little different. But obviously I'm a high school offensive coordinator, and the things that you value most are the players that let you do the most things, are the players that don't restrict what you're doing. And I think it's the same thing in this game. It's the same thing in the NFL. It's the same thing when we talk to NFL coaches. Obviously, like, I think Kyle Shanahan's an interesting example of this because it's like, hey, we got Brock Purdy and we've kind of built around him. But one of the reasons he ends up getting the job is because he let Kyle do more than he'd been accustomed to with his previous quarterbacks. Like, Kyle can insulate a quarterback like it's somebody's business. But having a guy that can create off schedule, make some tough throws over the middle, be more of a playmaker, like, Kyle went with the playmaker. And I think ultimately that's what we're doing. Like, when you watch Hurts, for example, there's a deliberateness that is there with his feet. He's got to see throws. He's still kind of developing as a passer, and I think Dak is there. And I think that's where that subtlety comes in. And when you're talking about levels, like that was another thing they mentioned in the question. It's small. Like Dak and Jalen's maybe different because I feel like there's a pretty big discrepancy between the two of them. Like I think Dak's probably like a top 6, 7 player. I think Jalen's probably down in that 10, 11, 12 range. And again, they're close, but in terms of a guy that's going to elevate your roster and I don't have to work around as much, it's Dak. And I think like that's where it seems like there's a definitive one too. Now, you take CeeDee Lamb and A.J. Brown, and it's kind of like, I don't know how you feel about it, Craig, but it feels to me like they're almost the same. You know what I mean? Like they're very, very similar.
Yeah, they go about it differently, but ultimately at the end of the day, you're going to get similar-ish results.
Right.
Like production-wise.
Yeah, and I think that's the issue. Is like A.J. Brown wins with horsepower, so vertical speed, strength down the field. He's a true X. CeeDee Lamb is maybe not a true X, but he's a better F, he's a better Z, and he can play X for you, and he has more route running nuance, but lacks that vertical horsepower. Still a great player, and just depends on, to me, that's like, 6 in one, half dozen in another. Like, if you're like, gun to your head, who could you pick? Like, I don't really have a preference, It depends on the offense I want to run, and I think that's where those decisions become a little bit more challenging in terms of grading it out and ranking the difference between players, because I don't think there's that big of a difference between them. It comes that comes down to schematic usage more than anything, in my opinion.
Yeah. It's also why, I think that what's happening in San Francisco, sidebar for a second, is so fascinating right now. The news broke, right? We're recording this. It's now 3 o'clock on Tuesday. So an hour and a half ago or whatever it was, Mike Garafolo and NFL Network broke the news that Brandon Aiyuk has officially requested a trade.
No.
And I think that, we've just, for people listening, aren't you guys going to talk about that? Seems like a big deal considering how much time you spent with Jaden Daniels. We have quite a bit. The beauty of a podcast is it's on demand. So just scroll back a little bit in the archive, and you got that there. And we'll have some more coverage on the Hoffman Show. So if you want to flip over to the Hoffman Show feed, assuming that you're listening to this sometime after 7 o'clock on Tuesday night, you'll have something there. But with Aiyuk, Aiyuk's a phenomenal wide receiver. He probably is a better pure player in most offenses than, say, Deebo Samuel. If I was Kyle, you would know better than me. You know Kyle, you know that offense inside and out. If I was Kyle from the outside, the way I see it, I'd rather have Deebo than I would have Brandon Aiyuk, and which is a decision that they seem to have potentially contractually made. We'll see, if they can just get Aiyuk to play out this year on this contract, they can make this decision and see how Deebo plays out this year. He battled some injuries last year, et cetera, et cetera. But because of the versatility and how many different guys can do what Deebo does, 4 in the entire league, versus what Aiyuk can do, which is, let's say it's 12 to 15 guys, even at that level. Aiyuk is special, but is the drop off to, I'll use Terry. Aiyuk, I think, is a better player than Terry at this stage in their careers.
Sure.
I think
but
most
is the
GMs,
drop off that crazy?
But the drop-off's not very significant. And so I think that's the thing that's interesting, right, is you have the uniqueness of certain players or the importance of certain positions. Is a certain defensive end more well-rounded than Micah Parsons? Maybe. But would you rather have the well-rounded guy who's a B-plus pass rusher or Micah Parsons who's an A-plus pass rusher? You'd rather have Parsons because that particular skill is so important to that position. And so this stuff does get really hairy, really messy. There is a level of personal preference. There is a level of schematic fit. There is a level of, does that guy play for a coach that'll maximize what he does well? Right. But I think the last thing I'll say real quick is, don't confuse, and this is the thing that always falls on the most deaf of ears, Logan, is when we say player X is better than player Y, it doesn't mean that player Y sucks and we hate them.
Right.
It's just a lot of times it's you asked, so we did the ranking, and we'd take this guy slightly ahead of this guy, but if we got stuck with the other guy, we'd be perfectly happy. But because we picked one over the other, it's human nature to be oh, so you hate the other guy. And it's no, but fine. I understand how this works. I've been doing the radio thing long enough to understand how this works.
It's interesting with the Brandon Aiyuk thing. I think that's a really good example of kind of what we're talking about because, like you were mentioning that Deebo or Brandon Aiyuk, and I think when you go back and you watch, and I haven't watched this in this level of detail. I was actually listening to a podcast and it came up. And basically what they were saying was that, Aiyuk is there to kind of be your route running winner. He's supposed to win versus man-to-man coverage. He's supposed to be able to kind of be the guy you can turn to in any situation, because Debo's not that guy. Debo's got his own kind of special skill set, right? And the speaker was basically saying that Aiyuk was not able to do that in the biggest game of the year in the Super Bowl. And if you remember, they kind of had some difficulty with tight throwing windows versus man-to-man coverage. And he was arguing that that's why you go out and you draft a route running purist like Ricky Pearsall, like a true receiver. Like, we talked about him a lot from Florida. He was like maybe one of the best route runners in the class. He's got great hands, great feel, can run the choice, any route you want, he can run. If you watch him at the Senior Bowl, he was uncoverable, right? And you watch his ability to make contested catches uncoverable. And so you are transitioning away from like these kind of the running back in Deebo Samuels, the yards after catch guy in Aiyuk, and saying we need dudes of this certain ilk. And that's the thing that breaks rankings, right? Is honestly, it's like, can this dude, player, whoever, win consistently as a receiver versus man-to-man coverage? And if I don't think he can do it, like if he has shown, like, he does all these other things well, like Aiyuk, we talk about his vertical speed, his competitive toughness, his ability to block, like check, love all that stuff. But if he can't win versus man-to-man coverage, that's a separator. And that's a separator for coaches, and that's a definite. That's what makes the top receivers in the NFL. You talk about your Tyreek Hills, your Justin Jeffersons, CeeDee Lamb, AJ Brown. Insert your top guy, is that they can win consistently versus man-to-man coverage, and those are the types of things that separate guys out. And I think that's a really good comparison there, because if he's requested a trade, if they can't get to the number that he wants, it's because they feel that he can't do something that this new guy can do. And I think when you look at the route running profile, again, I got to study this a little bit more. I think that might be the reason why. And again, that doesn't mean he's a bad player. It just doesn't mean he's a top 5 player. It could be a top 10 player, but he's definitely not a top 5 player in this example. And I'm not saying he doesn't get there, they don't financially work it out, but that's something that I think is a good example of things that separate good from great.
Yeah, since we're down the rabbit hole, like I think, I don't know if you've watched Receiver on Netflix yet, Logan.
Not yet. No. Is it good? Is it worth it?
It's so good. And Debo and Kittle are featured, and we're 7 of the 8 episodes in right now. So we're like in the playoffs at this point, and it's really interesting remembering some of the games that Debo had last year, and hearing George Kittle talk about the impact Debo has, and Kyle talk about the impact Debo has on that offense, because they, like, the way Kyle has schemed it up is part of what makes it so difficult is there are certain guys that just wind up where they don't belong, right? Like Debo, what's he doing in the backfield? McCaffrey, what's he doing out wide? Yeah. Why is Kittle over there? Where's Kyle Juszczyk? What is he doing? He's supposed to be a fullback. Why is he lined up at X? Like there's those pieces that are designed, and some of them are distractions on given plays. Some of them are the actual advantage they're trying to create. And when Debo went out last year, you saw his value, because that stuff, like Kyle had this amazing quote in there where he goes, "We don't just put in our backup Debo. Like, we don't have a backup Debo."
Right.
And so even though Debo's not this technical route runner or whatever, the fact that you can put him in almost any position on the field as a skill position and he can score is an invaluable, like, that is a separator amongst traits. So if you're lining up, like, who are the best technicians, who's got the best agility, who's got the best this, Debo might not particularly score on, well, the agility one he might, but he might not particularly score highest on the things you draw up is like, here's my ideal scouting profile of a receiver, but the ability to score from anywhere on every single play is a trait that just not many dudes in the league have. And that value to what they do in San Francisco is so extraordinarily high that they stared down the contract stuff a couple years ago when he wanted to trade, and they were like, "No, we're not right. Trading you because you're too valuable to us." And you see the same thing with McCaffrey. Like, they paid McCaffrey like a weapon, not like a running back. And Kittle has some of that. Juszczyk has some of that. And I think that's like the interesting thing about Aiyuk is that he doesn't. He's a receiver. And so if Kyle goes, well, we need to pay the weapons, I can find another receiver in the draft, eventually you run out of money, and that kind of feels like what might be happening here with Aiyuk, is that he might wind up being the odd one out, not because he's not exceptionally good, but because he is more replaceable than the other dudes in that offense.
And I also think it speaks to a vision, a personnel vision. I think when you look at like Miami, there's no team in my opinion that has a stronger vision for their offense. Like they want fast dudes. That's what they want, right? So if you're not fast, bye, right? If you look at Kyle, I think he does a good job, and John Lynch and the whole staff there of basically saying like, we want dudes that don't fall into conventional buckets. Like we got a fullback that can play tight end and play slot receiver. Like we have a receiver that can play running back, which is very unusual. And he's such a dangerous weapon. He plays receiver like a running back. We've got a running back that can play like receiver. We've got, a tight end who's maybe one of the best mismatch weapons in the NFL. Like, and all of those guys are kind of bucket lists and category lists. And that in the same way speed presents a conflict for the defense, that lack of clear definition in the offense also presents issues. So, for example, like think about this, you can be in an empty with 5 wide receivers in that offense. And they have that guy, Jennings from Tennessee, is that his name? Number 15 for them?
Yeah, Juwan Jennings. Who's
basically like a big wide receiver, but also plays like a tight end. You can be in that and get to 21 runs in terms of personnel, because Debo can play running back, Jennings can play tight end, and they have another little receiver there that can block a nickel like a fullback, right? And all of a sudden, like think about the consternation that puts the defense in. And Kyle is able to do that with that personnel every single down. So I think you bring up a great point there. Maybe Aiyuk is traditional enough that Kyle feels like he can, or Kyle, whoever is involved with this decision, feels like they can replace him because he doesn't, again, we're talking about categorizing and ranking players, doesn't fit in kind of this positionless area. Like he is too traditional to kind of maximize their offensive identity. Maybe.
Yeah, no, it's going to be fascinating to watch. Of course, this is a Commanders adjacent story because of the relationship with Jaden Daniels, and it seems like this is Aiyuk's preferred destination. It's also, I think, Commanders adjacent because this would be one of the first major non-draft moves, but veteran adjacent decisions that John Lynch will make without Adam Peters, who's now here and was such a huge part of that personnel department out in San Francisco. All right, question 2, Logan. That was we actually, I feel like, answered 4 questions within that one. But this one's really fun. From Scott, how much influence do you see the offensive coaching staff having when it comes to some of the issues that Cliff had, especially later in the season in Arizona? And do you think they have the right mix of coaching to produce an offense that improves throughout the season? So for those that don't remember, Cliff's offenses were somewhat famous/infamous for stagnating at the end of years, caught a lot of flack for maybe not making some adjustments, teams being onto him, the records that he had in December at the end of the year, multiple years in Arizona, and going back, frankly, to Texas Tech when he was the head coach there, were not very good. So it seems like that is a bugaboo based off the results, Logan. 1, do you think it's legit? And 2, what do you think about the ability to not have that happen this year, especially with some of the other staff around him?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is legit. I think it's a real criticism. As brilliant as I think Cliff has shown himself to be at times, I think there are moments where you stumble, and I think that's the thing about college compared to the NFL. Is I had a conversation with a college coach, forget where this was, who had basically come for a year from college to the NFL, and he was really worn out. We were like in week 14 or 15. He was exhausted, and I said, "Man, like you've done this before. Like college, I've heard is worse." Because you got to recruit, you got all this stuff. And he looks at me and says, "Man, like every week you're in it. Like you're in it. You're in a fight. And in college, you get a couple just layup knockouts. Like we don't need to put our best foot forward." And I do think there's something to that. And I think you've seen young coaches go through spells. Like Sean McVay had that kind of criticism levied against him a couple years ago, where they get to week 9, 10, and people had figured out his offense, right? I will say Kyle, too, there's been periods where I played for him where it's like they seem to have figured out, and Kyle does a great job of innovating and adjusting, and so does Sean. But I think the offensive, in answer to the question, I think the offensive staff is imperatively important. Like I can't stress how important it is, because basically as the coordinator, it's your vision, right? It's your identity. But it's the staff's responsibility, in my opinion, in my estimation, to kind of keep you innovating. Like for my quarterback coach to be like, "Hey man, I did a project last week. Like we are 60% run out of this formation. We probably got to throw in some more passes. Hey, man, like we're in this formation a lot. We get a little stagnant. Like you seem to default to these plays. Let's make sure that we're thinking about, and that's making sure you have good people around you, right? Oh, we're having an issue with protection. I got to go to my O-line coach. He's got to get me cleared up. We're having a hard time with these runs. Is there anything else we feel good about? Like that innovation comes not only from the coordinator, who's got to be a brilliant dude, but from the people who support him. Like I think that's something that people undervalue. Like think about one of the things that made Kyle great in Atlanta is that he had Matt LaFleur, he had Mike McDaniel, he had Raheem, what's Raheem's last name? Head coach
Morris?
of Atlanta. Yeah, Morris.
Yeah.
They were all on the same staff under him, supporting him to make sure he was staying ahead of the curve in Atlanta, and they almost won a Super Bowl, right? And I think that I can't overstate how important that staff will be to maximizing what Cliff and this offense can become and will become.
Yeah, and I think there's great people around to do that if they communicate well. And this was always kind of our point of, hey, if this is at its best, what's going to happen is this staff will coalesce. And it looks like, I mean, the way they worked together in the spring was awesome on the field. I don't know what it was behind the scenes, obviously, but on the field, they were so cohesive with how smoothly everything ran. And I was just like, wow, I can't believe these guys had never worked together before. But there was clear cohesion going into every day. They seemed highly organized. We'll see once they get into the season and they have to make adjustments and work together, under that kind of timeline crunch of we got a couple days to put together a game plan, implement it, teach it to the players, get them ready, and then go execute on Sunday, repeat, times 17. But it's either going to be that where they can implement new ideas and from Brian Johnson to Anthony Lynn to everybody else down the staff, those guys can put forth ideas and be like, here's a solution to our problem. Does this fit what we want to do? Or the worst version of it is what happened in Carolina, where everyone could never get on the same page. And even though there's a bunch of coaches that a lot of people think are really smart in that Panthers offense last year, it's an utter disaster and everyone gets fired. I don't think that's going to happen, but certainly if they don't come together and the offense really struggles, and especially if AP feels like this is bad for Jaden's development, like they'll have a new offensive staff next year. They will not hesitate to, considering the resources spent on the quarterback position. So more specifically, I think Lynn plays a really critical role, not only as the run game coordinator, as someone who's played or coached multiple run schemes, but as the guy who has been around now the NFL as a coach for nearly 25 years. He started coaching in 2000. So coming up on his 25th year of coaching, or this maybe, I guess, is his 25th year of coaching. And so he's seen it. He's been through that grind. Cliff has done it as a head coach. He's never done the NFL grind as a pure offensive coordinator. I'm hoping that helps, by the way, that he doesn't, later in the season, are you dealing with stuff as a head coach, drama, whatever, injury management that takes away from your ability to grind as an OC and as a coordinator? Cliff doesn't have to worry about that. But Anthony Lynn's been through that as an NFL coordinator and as an NFL head coach. And so his ability to give that input, I think, is huge. Brian Johnson's, obviously very, very highly thought of as a schematic brain. How do he and Cliff work together to make sure that they're putting Jaden in this offense in the best positions? To Bobby Johnson and everything he's brought from Buffalo / New York, where he was with Brian Dable and some of the quarterback run stuff. Like they have enough brains in the room. Not to mention like David Blau, assistant quarterbacks coach. He was a player last year. Yeah. It's funny, like throughout that receiver series on Netflix, there's like, oh, there's Adam Peters popping up in San Francisco. There's David Blau, backup quarterback in Detroit. Like they have so many different brains that have been in so many different offenses. Like you should have a solution to a problem, no matter what the problem is. The real question for them, the real challenge for them is to make sure it's cohesive within what they're trying to do. It fits their identity, and that's ultimately Cliff's job and as the OC, and there's only so much that he can get the help with that. But someone like Lynn, I think, is probably a great voice to lean on.
100%. And I think you hit all the points there. It's just about how they come together, how they communicate, how is Cliff in that OC role. That's something I hadn't really thought about, but yeah, it's the first time he's doing that without the head coaching responsibility, so I think that's great. So yes, in answer to the caller's question, or the whatever, where we got that question from, I think it's Twitterer, yeah, that Xer or whatever we're calling it now. It's extremely important. And that's something that, like, you talk about things that I'm watching at training camp, like how does it look? And then in the season, how are we developing? How are we maturing? How are we kind of subverting expectations and staying out in front of the heavy analytics stuff? Like, that's going to be a big deal. So I think it's extremely important, but I do think, to your point, Craig, they've got the brains, and now it just comes down to how does the team come together.
So can you, real quick, because I think this is, we don't get a chance to do this stuff as much during the season, or we do and it feels much more urgent because we're trying to give like real-time analysis versus asking this question now. What's an example of an improvement that a team can make? Because it's one thing to be like, wow, they have more passing yards per game. They've improved. But like when we go in terms of the process, like, what are some of the types of adjustments that actually do get made during a season, even if it's not like, oh, we improved that, but we changed that, which created a better outcome? Like, what are some of those things that you would be looking at if you're Cliff and this staff in the middle of the season to actually change and tweak?
I think one of the things that I find to be the most helpful, I think back to 2012, and it's just understanding how the offense fits with the defensive personnel and the special teams. And I think that takes time, right? Because as an offensive staff, you spend a lot of time together, you work on the same things, you become a little bit of an echo chamber in terms of offensive football, but you are on a team, right? You're on a team, and understanding how that offense fits with that group, and then understanding, especially with a new group of players, what people do well. Right? You go in with a vision and you say, I think these things, these 5 things are what we're going to set our identity by. And then all of a sudden you say, man, the quarterback actually does this other thing better, right? And we don't do this thing very well. Like, let's cut that and do more of this other thing. And I think that's where, like Anthony Richardson with the Colts last year before he got hurt, they were like, he's a good runner, but he's a much better passer than we thought. So why don't we, if he had been healthier longer, they probably would have leaned into more drop back passing stuff, I think. And that takes 5, 6, 7 games. Like some people say, like I've had coaches tell me, there's 4 quarters to the season, but it's really the last 2 are the ones where you really kind of find yourself, or you should be finding yourself. And so that's 8 weeks of football where hopefully you win over half of them, but you kind of figure out what's going to make you good for the home stretch. So understanding what guys do well, understanding how you fit within the team are I think, probably the lowest hanging fruits. Obviously, there's some other things in terms of saying, actually, like these 4 runs we're better at, where our running percentage is better. Let's find more ways to get there. Let's emphasize running the football more, or emphasize these types of passes more, or emphasize this concept more. Those are the little tweaks that I think are brilliant and make good offensive coordinators great, is they're really good at saying, we thought this, but it's actually this. And that comes down to personnel, comes down to play design, it comes down to play selection. And I think that's where you see really good teams kind of excel, is that they're really good at, coaching staffs they're really good at identifying those factors.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, last person I'll mention here is like DQ's got to say.
That's true.
As a defensive mind, like as a self-scout, if I was Cliff Kingsbury, I'd be like, Dan, can you please watch our offense every week with your defensive coordinator hat on and tell me how you would attack us so that I have answers?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think, again, it's just building that relationship, setting up that line of communication, because that's where that change comes, right? When it's someone says, hey, man, we do this a lot, and teams are kind of picking up on it. What's the counterpunch off of it? I think that's something that I think would be pretty helpful for sure.
Yeah. Move a little faster through a couple of final questions here in our Take Command summer mailbag. This is a good one from Benjamin. We probably could do like a full podcast on this, but we're just going to take a quick hitter, and if we want to do a full podcast on it, there's always next week. What analytical trends are we on the forefront of that could explode in the next few years? And then he had a follow-up on CBA limited reps for offensive line and body types and things. But I kind of think it all kind of plays together. What are some of the things that when you talk to your buddies around the league are like the analytical trends of what people are looking at, whether that's roster management, whether that's certain types of players, whether that's play styles or types? Like what are the things that are hot in the analytics world right now?
I mean, there's so much stuff. I think the most simplistic one is probably how teams are using GPS data in practice. I know that's something that's been going on for a while, but the GPS data is just getting better and better. Like I remember having a conversation with a guy about eccentric load. So like basically the lengthening of muscle tissue on like when you're stopping, right? The tissue moves differently than when you're like running or whatever. And when you look at like force velocity stuff, this is really nerdy, so sorry, but when you look at force velocity stuff, those numbers are really like insanely high, but we weren't very good at quantifying them. We were good at quantifying acceleration because of the machine had like these dynamometers in them, that would manage acceleration, they'd manage top speed, and that's good to a point, but you're not, for receivers especially, you're not tracking like one of the most important metrics, which is how many decelerations you're accumulating in a practice, how many they accumulate in a game. And so as that technology is improved, basically the strength coaches now can be like, oh, he got 40 high intensity decelerations today in practice. Let's make sure our off season resembles that. Let's make sure his in-game week represents what he's going to be expected to execute in the game in conjunction with the top end speed. So I think that's something that's going to be really, really helpful, like from a sports science standpoint. And the other thing is like that, the question we just kind of started talking about, and it is something we could talk about the whole show, but there are interesting metrics that teams look at that I think fans aren't aware of, especially in the draft. Like it's these height, weight, minimum threshold buckets. That's something that's been going on for a while, but it's also kind of goes in conjunction with these interpersonal psychology interviews now, which I would kind of classify as advanced metrics, and they're getting better in terms of identifying learning styles. They're getting better in terms of identifying, like defensive personality. Like it's really cool to hear sports psychologists that, are at the combine or whatever, talk about some of the things that they're trying to peel the onion back on in terms of making sure that they have the guy that not only fits within their culture, but can learn within their culture. And now they're actually developing programs to actualize how to best kind of take that data and make sure the player that they do draft integrates well within the culture of the team. So those are a couple, but again, there's some bone density thing, like there's a whole bunch of stuff, but those are two of the ones that I've kind of been the most impressed by because I think they have the biggest turnaround right now. But some of the other kind of more advanced medical things I think are also pretty interesting too.
That's so interesting because I feel like analytics are talked about a lot more in basketball and baseball, and for those, like analytics in baseball are kind of funny because there is a huge scouting element. Like I know exit velocity is a big one, or spin rate for pitchers. Like there's stuff that people look at and it's like, oh, this is actually a huge measurement for us in terms of how good this player can be. But in basketball, I feel like the analytics discussion is the most about the actual gameplay. Where like, I'm sure there is a lot of similar stuff like decelerations and stuff in basketball is huge. Lateral quickness and the ability to change directions, like all that stuff is huge. But ultimately, analytics helped reshape the game, the whole geometry of it. Once people realize like, wow, 3 is more than 2. Maybe we should try to hunt 3s. But what if we miss a certain amount? Well, here's the amount we can miss that makes it even and worth it compared to this number of 2s. And also, if we're going to take 2s, let's make sure we take them from these spots in the floor because then it's worth it to take the 2 because we make it a high enough percentage. And like those basic factors reshaped the entire geometry of the game. Then you also had kind of the interpersonal scouting, if you will, of like, oh, okay, part of a scouting report used to be, I watched film on the guy, he likes to go left. Well, now you have the actual data that says when he goes left off a one dribble pull-up, he shoots 67%. And if you can force him right, then he's 45% of the time he'll pull up, 55% of the time he'll try to get to the rim. On the pull-ups, he shoots 48%. When he gets to the rim, he shoots X%. Like you have all this data about the game itself. And I think that's what's so interesting about football is there is not data, as far as I know, that says like, yep, gap scheme running is better or zone running is better. And I think that when I think about analytical trends, and it's something that I've talked about with Seth Walder from ESPN when he came on the show in the fall, talk about some of the analytics stuff around like Eugene Shen getting hired, et cetera, is, some of the analytics will suggest that you should do thing X. But I think when you watch the tape, you realize that it's not necessarily that thing is better. It's correlated, or it's like correlation but not causation, right? If we're going to be nerdy about it, that's pretty baseline nerdy, but nerdy enough of like there's a schematic explanation for this that you can potentially exploit to go against the grain of the pure information. And I think that is still the uncovered terrain in the NFL and in football in general is the marriage between scheme and analytics. The numbers say that X should happen, but it might be happening because Y, and Y is more important than the number itself.
Well, I do think you saw a similar transition in terms of, like you mentioned, like the 3-point game in basketball. I thought that was a really interesting comparison. And I think you see the same thing in football schematically with the prevalence of throwing the football and how they've legislated certain things. And so obviously there's been a similar transition, right? And I think we were talking about this the other day. Think about how defenses have changed, right? They defend the heat map. They're built to stop the pass because that's what teams are doing. And now you're seeing teams that run the football more effectively, analytically, right, be more effective offensively because the running game is becoming more efficient because there is a discrepancy in size that's showing up in the data, right? It's slowly showing up. It's one of the reasons why, like, when Harbaugh goes to Michigan and they implement this run-first offense, like, they start winning football games. It's like the same reason that, the Cleveland Browns or the Detroit Lions, teams that are kind of run-first teams, are super effective because it's affecting their ability to find explosive plays in play action. That all shows up, right? And it seems to be trending the other way. But I think to your point, like, why isn't it more concrete like it is in basketball? There's just more variables. And I think when you talk to analytics people, I'm always a little bit confounded, actually, by the things that they overlook. Like the things that they think that they think it kind of falls into these larger buckets. But as a football person, I'm like, that's not the same thing. The double team on this play is not the same as the double team on this play, and you're categorizing it the same. And that, to me, is where that next level of detail from an analytics perspective, to your point, schematically, I think needs to kind of develop and mature. Because it's like, yeah, like this is like this double team on outside zone, this defensive tackle is not impacting the play the same way he is on a double team for a gap scheme run. But why are they in the same thing? Yes, they're both double teams, but who cares? You know what I'm saying? Like it's schematically different. So to me, you need different buckets, like one for outside zone, one for pass, one for quick game. Go down the list. The problem is you get into such small sample sizes there that it becomes inactionable data, right? And I think with basketball, you're playing 80 games in a season, like the sample sizes are so much larger that you can do more of that stuff. But when you talk to these analytics guys, I think one of the reasons they don't get super into the weeds is that the sample sizes are murderously small for any kind of meaningful conclusion.
No, I think that's 100% right. There's only 17 games. And, guys only play X number of snaps. And there's just, like, outside of quarterbacks and heat maps and stuff like that, where there's actually, like, decent amount of data. I mean, even routes run. Like, when you're the primary, do we want to evaluate that route the same as when you're on the backside of a play and you're dead because of the coverage before the ball snapped?
Like I got a great example of this. So I do, like, schematic evaluations for different guys around the league, and they'll come to me, defensive players, and be like, hey, is there a tell for same side gun pitch to the tight end? And you're like, okay, I'll just watch all of those. And as you go through, you're like, okay, there's only 5 of these plays the whole year, right? Or for the last 5 games. So you're like, this is kind of how they line up, but they on same side gun zone away, they also line up like this too. So it becomes impossible to find any kind of formational tell or positional tell that would give you that magic bullet that these players are looking for. And that's the thing that I think becomes super frustrating, is it's like, and that's one of the things that I love about football, is you still have to play the game. Unlike baseball, which has become totally analytics driven, and it sounds like basketball is moving that direction. Football, you still have to kind of go out and line up and play it, and you can still find, technical advantages through scheme, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, like, it's funny too, because, like, football is the most scripted, and so in some ways you think like the analytics would be like, soccer has had a real struggle with analytics because it is the most unscripted.
Correct.
Like in basketball, even though it's a free-flowing game, like you run plays, you run sets. There's not really a lot of that in soccer. Like there's principles that, overlapping runs and things, and hey, obviously set pieces, but like that's actually the funny thing, right? Is as research and coaching has gotten to a higher level in soccer, more or a higher percentage of goals come from set pieces, corner kicks, free kicks, etc., versus in open play. And so it's kind of funny how that winds up working. And there definitely are soccer coaches that have taken like route concepts from football or plays from basketball to try and create opportunities. And so you would think in some ways like the scripted nature of football would lead to more analytics. Like we can script this thing to happen, but at the end of the day, it's still sports. And like, you can script the perfect play and then Aaron Donald splits a double team and you're dead. And there's nothing you can do about it. Or your wide receiver falls down or, whatever. There's a million variables. And I think with football especially, what makes it so wild is you have 22 guys on the field. And so, half of them on a particular play based off what side the ball goes to might not really matter. And when basketball, you got 10 dudes on the floor and one of them is LeBron James, well, like that changes everything. So it's a really fun conversation that could go on forever, and something that I'm sure will come up at various times as we look at certain numbers and certain ways to analyze the game throughout the season. We have a bunch of questions still left on the table that are really good, including some fun ones. Unfortunately, it's now 3:34, and I host a radio show every day that starts at 4 o'clock. So today is not the day that this podcast is going to go long. But Thursday, who knows? Maybe we'll just get right back to it on Thursday. Some really great questions. Appreciate everyone who tweeted us and sent Logan Instagram messages, et cetera, et cetera. If you're not on social media, you can still get to us. Just go to hoffmanshow.com and use the contact link, and you can submit your mailbag questions there. Training camp, not that far away. 8 days away is first practice. It's on the 24th. So we are almost through the dog days of summer. And if you are not subscribed, now would be a good time. Whether you're watching on YouTube at the Team 980, at 1067 The Fan, or at Craig Hoffman, or, of course, if you're listening in your favorite podcast app, hit subscribe, hit follow, hit whatever it is in your favorite app, or whichever one you're listening to right now if you're mad at your favorite app and chose to use a secondary one today. All right, for Logan, I'm Craig. Thanks for listening, and we will see you next time on Take Command.